Hi everybody, I'm Elex Michaelson and welcome to this special San Diego 6 webcast. California has a special election on May 19th with billions of dollars at stake. The governor says the state needs to pass several propositions for the state to be financially viable. But recent polls show most people disagree. On this webcast, we aim to break down the ballot in simple and understandable language. We promise this will not be a snooze fest, but an important, balanced, and objective look at propositions 1A through 1F. And we could have no better guide than political analyst John Dadian of Dadian Associates to help walk us through it. John, great to see you again.
Good to see you, Alex.
All right, so the big question is, why this election in the first place?
Well, what this special election with these propositions on, what they came out of is the last legislature budget session. It was a compromise, and a lot of these, the only way that these can be enacted is by a vote of the people. So the legislator decided to put these on to hopefully solve some of the budget problems.
And we realize that the last issue, as part of that February compromise, we've got a full screen to talk about some of this, they came up with a plan that would lead to some $12.5 billion in tax increases, $15 billion in tax cuts, but this counting on these propositions to pass. The first proposition we're going to take a look at is Proposition 1A. That would increase the state's rainy day fund. Right now, the rainy day fund is at 5%. This is going to increase it to 12.5%. And let's bring up that graphic. And then higher taxes for 2 years. Those are some of the taxes that were just brought in. It would also increase spending restrictions. Some of those taxes includes a sales tax increase, 1 cent for every dollar of goods purchased, a vehicle license fee, which would increase from 0.65% to 1.15%, and the personal income tax, which would increase 0.25%. We've seen those increases already, but they would become permanent at least for the next 2 years. Proposition 1A is really the linchpin for everything else, right?
That's exactly the term the governor's office is using, the linchpin, that if this doesn't pass, the others really are either affected. Some of them won't take an effect at all or are greatly reduced. And that's exactly right. That's what's happening with 1A. What they tried to do is they tried to give a little bit of to please everybody. They were afraid that the conservatives, meaning, of course, a lot of Republicans, wouldn't like it if it was just to raise the taxes, which this does keep a tax increase for the next 2 years. So that's why they tried to put it in. They've actually used the word in the initiative, the word rainy day, and that does appeal to conservatives. So a conservative who doesn't like the tax hike, but then he does like the budget reserve and the spending limits.
And he's brought together quite an impressive coalition. We got the California Teachers Association, fire, police, the California Chamber of Commerce, all behind this, but yet it's still not doing great in the polls.
Well, and the word that I hear more and more is to describe this as far as the coalitions as strange bedfellows, which happens a lot in politics, but this one even more so than ever. A lot of those coalitions you just mentioned usually don't agree on things. They are agreeing on this one.
But one group that is not agreeing on this is the California Republican Party, even though the governor himself is, you could say, the leader of the Republican Party, although some Republicans might disagree with that. Well, let's talk about the next proposition, which is Proposition 1B, which heavily depends on Proposition 1A to pass. If Prop A doesn't pass, Prop B really doesn't mean anything. Prop 1B is going to require $9.3 billion in K through 14 spending. Essentially, they're going to pay back the schools for some money that they've taken away from schools in the last few years. Those payments would start in 2011, something that the teachers union is arguing hard for. But interestingly, a lot of people say that our schools actually have too much money and need to do more with the money that they already have.
Well, that's exactly right. And again, if you see, especially in our region, locally, a lot of our local school districts are still putting bond measures on the ballots because they say they don't have enough money. What I find very interesting on this, you mentioned the endorsement in support of the California Teachers Association. They are putting a lot of money, reported to be $2 million, into supporting this initiative, but they're not putting that amount into 1A. And as you said, literally, if 1A doesn't pass, 1B will not take effect.
And so what exactly would 1B, though, mean for schools?
It would mean dedicated funds, and that's exactly what the teachers like about it.
Okay. Now we're going to go to Proposition 1C, which has to do with the idea of lottery modernization is the term that's being used here. Proposition 1C would change the way that the state borrows from the lottery. Essentially, the state would borrow $5 billion from future lottery money. It would also change that there would be no lottery money going to schools. Initially, when the lottery was set up, that was the whole purpose of the lottery, that the money would go to schools. This would change that. It would also create potentially bigger lottery jackpots in the future because it would, the concept essentially being that if you've got a bigger lottery payout, more people are going to spend for the lottery. But this, you say, might go against the idea of what 1A is all about.
That's exactly right. As I said, in 1A, they tried to put a little everything to please people, and so what they put in was the rainy day fund and the spending caps. What 1C is doing is literally going in debt. They're borrowing. It's not that they get $5 billion, and that's billion with the B, of course. It's that they're borrowing against it. And as we've seen in the lottery, it was done by ballot in 1984. We've seen it go up and down over those years. You can never count on that money. So if they borrow against it and then it goes down, the state's even in more financial problems. So I feel that it is parts of it are contradicting 1A.
And we should note that the lottery is down this year in a recession year as compared to other years, but the state hoping that more people start gambling their money, I guess. We'll also talk about our next proposition, which is Proposition 1D. This is about redirecting some of the money that are in there, again, trying to add more money to that general fund. Let's bring up the full screen. Proposition 1D would temporarily redirect $268 million from tobacco revenue. It would send that money into the general fund. This is all about child development and who pays for it.
That's exactly right. When this passed originally, the first five, when it passed on the ballot a few years ago, they formed in local governments, and San Diego County has a first five commission, and those are the folks who are currently overseeing the money. This would, there's different word term, redirect, shift, etc., but this would take that money out. A lot of people argue against this because they feel it is going against local control, which I feel is the best way to spend this money.
So essentially we're talking about Proposition 10, which passed back in 1998. So how would kids be affected then if this did pass?
Well, what this would do, this would shift, as you said, $260 million in annual revenues. It would shift it out of first five. And so there's an argument about whether or not that money would be actually helping who Prop 10 originally was destined for.
Right. And now we move on to Proposition E, which also redirects money. This time the question is mental health, though. Here it would move $230 million a year meant to pay for mental health funds, as we see on the full screen. Those funds would now go to pay for childhood mental health, they say, although that's sort of the argument on this one. Prop 1D, or 1E.
Well, one theme that you've seen so far since we're up to 1E that's running through a lot of these propositions is the whole reason, as you originally asked me, why this is on the ballot is because it tweaks some of the previous propositions that the state voters voted on. And once it is on the state ballot, the only way to change it is by by the voters to put it back on the ballot again. And that's what you're seeing here. I use the word they're kind of tweaking this, and that's exactly what they're doing, but the legislature did not have the authority nor the power to do so.
Right. California, more than almost any other state in the country, has such an easy proposition, initiative process, that the legislators end up getting kind of locked in more so than maybe in other states. Proposition 1F would lock the legislators into a different sort of pay scale. It would essentially say that elected officials would not receive any pay raises during deficit years. The director of finance would be the one who would determine whether it was a deficit year or not. Interesting that every single elected official voted to do this, which would essentially cut their pay.
Well, it would not cut their pay. It was a politically correct thing to do. Again, if you read it carefully, it's to increase their salary. So it doesn't increase pay. There have been propositions in the past that have gone nowhere that say that if there's a deficit or if they don't have a budget, that the legislators, their pay stops. That's never passed.
Okay. And so this is the only one so far that is actually winning in the polls. Every single proposition besides it is losing in the polls. The governor says this is so important, but what happens to the state if all of these propositions go down?
Well, one of the selling points they have on these propositions is doom and gloom. Fire and brimstone, that if they fail, it's nothing but catastrophe. Specifically, what will happen the next day, probably within 24 hours of the election, the governor of this state will call for a special session, bring legislatures in, and because they had problems with the budget before, he will literally lock them into the Capitol until they come to some type of solution for all these problems. And the only solution would be dramatic and draconian budget cuts.
And what would that mean kind of for the legacy of Arnold Schwarzenegger? This is coming towards the end of his term as California governor.
Well, the writing should have been on the wall for the governor because he does not have a good history when he had his propositions a few years ago, a package of propositions very similar to this, that those failed also. And people just don't like it. A lot of times the initiative process is started at the grassroots level, and those are the ones you see passing because it starts off with support. But when the elected officials tell the public this is good for you, a lot of times it's very hard to get a winning vote.
And it's interesting. Do you think that there's any chance for these propositions?
Well, that, as you reported polling, the major poll was done by Mervyn Field, who's one of the most respected pollsters in this state and in the nation. This was only done a few days ago, and specifically the margin was pretty wide for the 1A through E. So, no, it just doesn't look at a couple weeks before the election.
We'll have to see. We've still got a little bit of time. Thank you, John, for being our guide. Excellent work. And a reminder that you can log on to the California Secretary of State's website to read all the propositions for yourself. They're also in this booklet. Election Day is May 19th, and although many have already started voting by mail, we'll have complete coverage of this special election on san-diego6.com and, of course, San Diego 6 News in the morning and on the news at 10. For now, for all of us at San Diego 6 News, I'm Elex Michaelson. Thanks for watching.